My name's Alf Nilsson, and I'm the director of CASA. I also work as a professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Pretoria. As some of you might already know, CASA is a new initiative at the University of Pretoria, launched late last year, that's intended to work as a key hub of research in the field of Asian studies and the study of Afro-Asian connections in South Africa and on the African continent more generally. CASA is currently in its first year of substantial activity, and much of our current efforts gravitate around building relationships and fostering conversations between scholars in and off the Asian and African continents across research fields related to global challenges such as inequality and human development, democracy, governance and human rights, and sustainability and environmental justice. In today's webinar, we are going to unpack the economic and political turbulence that shook Sri Lanka in 2022. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Sri Lanka faced a severe balance of payments crisis in the first quarter of last year, which in turn set up a spiral in which a financial crisis morphed into an economic and social crisis, which in turn sparked a political crisis in which massive popular protests led to the resignation of both the country's prime minister and its president. These events dealt a solid blow to the Rajapaksa family that had governed the country on and off since 2005 on a platform of authoritarian populism. Following the waning of the protests, we've witnessed repression by the new government that was put in place, the deepening of the island's social crisis, and renewed protests. Only last week, in fact, Sri Lankan workers went on strike to protest an IMF rescue plan that'll bring both tax hikes and spending cuts. Now, this is, of course, a scenario that is significant in its own right, but I think it's safe to say that it should also command attention, interest, and solidarity from elsewhere in the global South, not least here in South Africa, which is facing deep and overlapping crises of its own as we speak. We're lucky, therefore, to have as our speaker today, Balansingam Skanthakumar, who in my humble opinion, and that of many others too, is one of the sharpest critical observers and analysts of Sri Lanka's political economy. Kumar is a member of the Social Scientists Association in Colombo and an editor of its online and print magazine Polity. Between 2018 and 2022, he was Senior Program Officer in the International Labour Organization's Country Office for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. His co-edited books include Upcountry Tamils, Charting a New Future in Sri Lanka from 2019, and Pathways of the Left in Sri Lanka from 2014. His research has spanned labor relations, development policy, linguistic minority rights, national human rights institutions, and local democracy. He holds BA and MA degrees in law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Welcome, Kumar, and thanks for joining us today. We're also lucky to have with us my colleague, Dr. Sithemble Mbete, as our discussant. Sithemble is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, where she teaches international relations and South African politics. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Pretoria, and one of the key focuses of our research is the politics of populism in the South African context. In addition to her academic work, Sithemble is well known as a prominent commentator on a range of issues in South African politics in national media. She also works as a program director for Future Elects, a nonprofit organization that delivers leadership development and training programs for ethical and innovative young leaders in Africa. Welcome, Sithemble, and thanks for joining us today. Housekeeping in our webinars is simple. Kumar will speak for about 45 minutes, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of comments from Sithemble. After a brief response from Kumar, we'll then open up for comments and questions from the audience, which can be put in the chat box or simply using the mic, whichever you're most comfortable with. That's all. Over to you, Kumar.
Thank you so much. May try to share this, and while doing so, also begin by expressing my thanks to Dr. Nielsen for this invitation, which took me by surprise. Many people have commented on the crisis last year, Much has been said. So I was grateful that he had somehow picked me out. And I'm also very grateful to Dr. Mbete for being the discussant today, because this topic is not a field of academic research for me. Um, it's, uh, uh, it's about something I observed and participated in as a citizen, but it's not a field of study. And populism, particularly, is not a field of research or inquiry. It hasn't been. So what happened was, Alpha asked me sometime last year to speak on the crisis and the protest, and I said fine. And then I thought, well, how do I dice this? I mean, there's just so much. How should I come to this? And then he framed it, and I thank him for it, in this way: populism, crisis, and protest. Of course, the only difficulty being that, as I said, populism, has not been a objective study for me. So this is why I'm grateful to have Dr. Mbete here. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that today is International Women's Day, and here is just a reminder about something that I will illustrate just a little while on, which is how important women's labor is for the economy, both in terms of paid work as well as unpaid care work. And there you can see how growth rate is being drawn, but on the back, literally, of the labor of women in the home, women who are domestic workers in the Middle East, women in the apparel factories, and women who pluck tea on our plantations. So today I've been asked to talk about what happened to the Rajapaksas, the family that had been dominant in Sri Lankan politics since 2005, as a consequence of the economic crisis of last year, really 2021, 2022, and also the incredible protest movement that many of you also witnessed on your TV screens. So the framing of this, the juxtaposition of populism, crisis, and protests suggests this proposition, and I simply set it out for us to see whether it holds, or whether there is you feel something, a way in which you would reformulate it, refine it, or perhaps even dismiss it. And that's that we have a populism of the right, represented here by the Rajapaksas, which is largely in power, loses power through an electoral contest, loses power, respects that mandate, respects that result rather, but then comes back to power in 2019 on an even larger majority, and with reinforced attachment to Sri Buddhist nationalism, which is the dominant nationalism, the majoritarian nationalism of this island, and also an expanded role for the military. But that this regime, which appears in 2019, 2020, unassailable, the question we asked ourselves at that point in time is, how many terms will they have? I mean, it's how many more elections will they win? How for how many more years or decades must we now prepare ourselves to be saddled with this family and with its successive generations? But then in 2021, all of this begins to unravel. A crisis builds up, and the broad contours of it, and it reaches a crescendo by early 2022. This crisis is of multiple origins. To the Rajapaksas, it is entirely a crisis which is external to Sri Lanka and external to them. It's a crisis of the COVID pandemic. It's a crisis rooted in the Ukraine, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So a combination of all of these external factors to neoliberal critics of the Rajapaksas. It's internal. It's entirely internal. The external, the external sector, the global economy, the rules of the game are fair, but it's simply how we haven't played them, and therefore the fault for this lies squarely solely with the Rajapaksas. So those are the two competing narratives: external versus internal, and internal, and that's why you see an invocation of populism. So when it comes, you see the neoliberal right criticizing the Rajapaksas as being populist. Of course, in the view of the neoliberal right, left populists, in the view of people like myself, right-wing populists. And decisions taken by the then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, tax cuts which reduced government revenue from taxation by half, ban on chemical fertilizers, sort of a rush to an organic-only policy which badly impacted the agricultural sector. These two, plus the resistance of the regime to go to the IMF early, to seek an IMF program, and to institute policy reforms that they believe to be necessary, policy reforms that in fact we are now living through with the current president. That these then trigger mass protests, and these are unique. These are unique because actually in Sri Lanka we don't a tradition really of mass protests. We haven't really seen anything like that since 1953, also, but in reaction to food price hike of that period. But rather, and this is the point that was made by political scientists in the 60s and 70s, that there's an opening line in a chapter which goes, the masses in Sri Lanka and the masses in Sri Lanka enter politics through elections. So that's the only period, that's the only moment at which you can feel the mass presence. So that was not the case at all last year, and we have these mass protests which take unique forms, not the traditional forms, not the traditional actors, not the traditional technologies of protest, unique forms, and these and one of the results or consequences is, as I've mentioned, the political crisis, which removes the cabinet, including the former president Mahinda Rajapaksa, and then his younger brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And which sort of banishes this family from the front lines of politics. And I promise I won't go through all of this, and I'm not going to do that by PowerPoint, but I just wanted to pick up on certain things, and it was easy for me to just arrange the information this way, on the political economy of the island, by way of them illustrating some of the things that follow. So I just want to pick up on a few things. One is sort of please note maybe I could start here with the inequality in household incomes. So here you can see growing inequality over the period of the last 40 years. So, so in other words, with neoliberal policies. So a concentration of income and also wealth right at the top. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is just looking at the ethnic breakup. Very large majority. And other communities being numerical minorities. And so this is then also reflected in terms of the face or the profile of the protest movement. If you look at where the population is based, this is something you might find interesting, which is that uh, of course, urbanization has been speeding up, but you still see, for official purposes, a very large section of our people classified as being in the rural sector. Now, there are debates about this definition of what constitutes rural, what constitutes urban, and so on. But even allowing for the fact that many of those, some of those in in the rural sector are actually in semi-urban, peri-urban communities. The point the point I want to underline here is how, contrary to World Bank prescriptions, even over this period of neoliberalism, we have this large number of people still living outside of cities and towns. And that becomes very important at a time of a food price crisis, as we experienced in 2021-2022, but also food supply chain issues that we experienced starkly with the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. So a large number of people who still have some access to land, some land on which they can grow something that they can also subsist on. Very important, really cushion many of the shocks. But then you have a population that also lives in the rural area, but on plantations, the so-called estate sector, who don't have access to arable land for their own cultivation. And then this explains then their particular vulnerability also to food price shocks and this hyperinflation that we live through. If you look at the size of the economy, well, this is a figure from 2021, but the economy contracted by 10% over the course of last year. 10%. That's really an enormous number. So the size of the economy now is comparable to that of Tanzania. Tanzania is slightly smaller than Tanzania or Ghana. And if you look at GDP growth rates, really, although there have been periods, including when Mahinda Rajapaksa was president, where GDP growth peaked at around 8%. If you look at the last 30 years, on average, you're looking at GDP growth of sort of 3 to 4%. So, anemic by Chinese standards. And then I want to draw your attention to the structure of our economy in terms of where our revenue comes from. And here, please note, and that was the point made by the cartoon that you saw just a little while ago, that the largest source of our foreign revenue since the 1980s has been migrant remittances. These are largely women doing domestic work, mainly in the Middle East. Then that's followed by ready-made garments, again with a largely women workforce. And then comes tea, which many people still associate Sri Lanka with, tea, which was its largest export earner, as I said, well into the early to mid 1980s. In fact, so at the time of independence from Britain, in 1948, tea, rubber, and coconut accounted for 80% of Sri Lanka's export earnings. So you can see this undiversified economy very high reliance on these tree crops. But then, even though there is a shift in the economic model in the late 1970s onwards, it continues to still have a very narrow export basket. As I said, the exports being ready-made garments, tea, and rubber, but still not able to match the inflows coming from migrant worker remittances. And then you can see tourism receipts. And here contrast the first number, which is what it was in 2021, sort of, COVID is kind of tailing off, and then the economic crisis is building up, and you can just see how it's sort of plummeted to 500 something million. But then look at what it had been in 2018. So you can already start to see then the warning bells. Even when you look at the figure on remittances, you can see how the figure for 2021 is significantly lower than that for 2019. And in fact, in 2022, it hasn't really recovered too much. And then we are in a debt trap. The debt, the external debt is in excess of 50 billion. Of course, we declared a default in April of last year. We're coming up to the first anniversary. But while we were servicing the debt, something like 30% of export revenues were for that purpose. And you can see how it has more than doubled from 10 years before, reflecting also the buildup of debt. So that what we have is almost trebling of external debt over the period of the Rajapaksas. And then I draw your attention also to what's happened with currency. So you can see this massive devaluation, depreciation of our rupee, which of course affects all of us in terms of our savings. It affects all of us in terms of then the cost of what we buy, because much of what we buy is imported. Even though we are an agricultural country, we are still a net food importer. And the figures on inflation. So here you can see how where we are just last month. Headline inflation over 50%, food inflation over 55%. So here is the rogues gallery, and I'm just showing you, of course, the faces of the sort of most central members of the clan, and the the argument. And so here I am drawing unfashionably from Hamza Alawi, is that what is associated with this family is a style of politics, populism, and in the literature on populism in relation to the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka, it is very interesting that people do some invoke populism as ideology with a focus on Cyril Buddhist nationalism, but lots of others do more as populism as political style and populism as a political strategy. And here you can see one of the ways in which populism manifests itself with the Mahinda Rajapaksa, second from the left, in power from 2005 to 2014. So here you see how the war victory, because remember, it's during his period in government that the war, the war which had a war since 1983, a war between the Sri Lankan state and Tamil separatism, a war in which the two nations respectively supported each other's, supported their respective nationalisms. That war comes to an end, and here you see Mahinda wishing to, of course, cloak himself in that victory. So on the front page of the, on the front cover of the note is his image. On the rear is this, of course, Iwo Jima is recreation, depiction. And in the background, you can see the different branches of the armed forces being acknowledged. So, so what's interesting is that this is a populism in power. You know, I'm trying to think back, and I wonder if anybody who's on, you know, any of the participants can step in later on this. What I don't recall is that when Mahinda Rajapaksa was making his ascent to the executive presidency, I cannot recall him being described as a populist then. I cannot recall really much deployment of this word. But once he is in power, there is certainly much more use of this. So here we are looking at a populism from above, a populism that is authoritarian, it's anti-democratic, it seeks to concentrate power in the executive, which is occupied by Mahinda Rajapaksa, and it seeks to diminish the role, the power of parliament. It's a majoritarian populism. It's a populism which is, it's a style which is associated very much with an ethno-religious bent, bias, which is not similar Buddhist. It's masculine. It's of course patriarchal, and that comes through also in government policy, in the public pronouncements of political leaders, including Rajapaksa himself, on women and women in the home, and so on. It's pro-capital. It has an anti-Western rhetoric. It's of course associated internationally with a pro-China tilt. And there's image building of the patriarch, the caudillo, as a charismatic hero, the hero who saved the nation, saves the nation from terrorism, saves the nation from bifurcation, who restores the pride of the people, who had experienced several military defeats or reverses in the 1990s, who feel besieged by human rights lobby, and so on, and then of course an economic culture of patrimonialism, one that enriches, one that uses but enriches family members, but also cronies, and a strong identification between the this particular project and quote unquote development here being mega development here being large scale infrastructure projects which then go on to bear the name of the hero, the leader, the patriarch. And the basis of support for this regime being cross-class, certainly the peasantry, but also the military, many in the military themselves being of peasant stock, the crisis of employment in the rural sector being such that there are few avenues for men, for women, there is migration to internal migration to garment factories, out-country migration for domestic work. So for men, the military become a magnet, but also having the support of the capitalist class. And the capitalist class not just not just a sort of a national capitalist, those who you would expect would warm to a nationalist rhetoric which offers them some defense or protection from foreign capital, which gives them some preferential access in the domestic market through tariffs and so on, but also which looks to receive certain subsidies and investments and government contracts and so on. But surprisingly also from big capital, and big capital, which initially is very much in the camp of the historic rival of this president and party. In fact, now the current president, big capital very quickly also then making peace with the Rajapaksas. And certainly it has to be said, support from within the working class, very importantly also from the Buddhist clergy, from the state bureaucracy, from civil servants, who again identify very strongly with this particular regime, and are very happy to be associated with it politically, and then certainly also the media mass. So all this is by way of just delineating some features which all of you will be familiar with, and then we see this transition to his brother, his younger sibling. So here, to me, there is a problem. The problem is that on the one hand, this Rajapaksa comes in calling himself the anti-politician, calling himself the person who is, I won't say, not going to drain the swamp, to coin a phrase, but certainly to discipline the animals in it, being the animals being political parties and politicians, professional politicians, who are blamed by the citizenry for mismanagement, for corruption, and so on. But then here, who are these traditional politicians? I mean, they include his brothers. They include his extended family. In fact, he was part of this administration. So on the one hand, seeking to distance himself from that, but on the other, on the other hand, of course, very much being, a legatee of that, and requiring or needing their support in order to govern. So in 2019, he wins this parliamentary majority. I mean, if you look at the percentage, it doesn't seem, perhaps, it's a little over, a simple majority. But what's significant is that in previous electoral contests, presidential contests, the margin between the first and second place have been much narrower. So here you see this much wider margin. You see also the polls showing a very, very strong, perhaps up to 80% of the similar community voting for this particular candidate, seen as somebody who is going to instill discipline in government and in the administration, someone coming from a military background who gets things done, someone above partisanship or party politics, and so on. This particular individual also coming in and seeking to base himself not on the political parties, including the party that nominates him, the party of his brothers, but rather as being the representative of a technocratic class, a group of professionals and business people who wish to do things differently and who see him as being the agent. But so that's the rhetoric, that's the promise for his supporters. But what does not change over the course of his short presidency, and of course, how can it change in a short period of time, is still the fundamental structure of the economy. And the fundamental structure is one where whatever, however much one uses the language of, smart this or smart that, and technology and digitalization and whatever else, buzzwords there can be, it's still an economy which is in trouble. It's in trouble because for decades there is a chronic balance of payments deficit. For decades, there is the trend is a trend which is, of course, exactly which is intensified by neoliberalism, for the import bill to be almost twice the export revenue, right? So you're spending almost $2 in imports, for every dollar that you earn. So this is a fundamental issue, and then how do you deal with it? How do you bridge this? Of course, so the only way you bridge the deficit is through borrowing, is through loans, and that's where again you see the same issues. So what's happening? What happens by 2021 is, remember, we have had 2 years of COVID, which means that you've had this tremendous blow when it comes to tourism. You saw the figure for how important tourism receipts were. Then you also have a shortfall. You also have a collapse in domestic production, partly in food, also in non-food, because of movement restrictions, mobility restrictions, and so on. Also a shrinking in terms of markets, demand for particular exports, specifically garments, clothing in Europe, in Western Europe, and in the United States, two big markets. So all of this comes together, and you have foreign exchange reserves, which are basically loans. Foreign exchange reserves, which are artificial. Artificial, why? Because the reserves are bolstered by going to the bond market, selling bonds, and taking that, and then temporarily showing it in your books as being part of your foreign exchange reserves. But by 2020, 2021, it's clear to anybody that the warning bells are there. It's clear that the economy is things are heading to the cliff, and then you start to see the ratings agencies beginning to, of course, devalue, downgrade Sri Lanka's credit worthiness. And already by 2020, 2021, it becomes impossible for Sri Lanka to go to the bond market any further, to borrow any further. So unable to borrow any further, pressure on the rupee, the government then spends $7 billion in trying to defend the rupee, to keep it at an artificial rate, exhausting the reserves. And finally, in January of 2022, there is literally no money in the treasury. No money means no money for our oil imports, no money for cooking gas. Then, of course, we have food prices shooting up. We have transport costs. We have farmer shortages, and exports still unable to bounce back after COVID. And we see a tapering away of remittances coming from the Middle East. So I want to show this to you because many comrades abroad assume that with the crisis that there would be a very strong buildup of resentment against the IMF, but in fact that hasn't happened. and it's the reverse. And I wanted to show this to you simply to illustrate that, in fact, in Sri Lanka today, there is enormous support for an IMF agreement, and that support now extends, it has to be said, to the unions and the left. I'll come to that if there's interest in the discussion. But I want to step back by also locating this crisis in the changes that take place in Sri Lanka from 1977. So remember, Sri Lanka is the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy, to adopt Washington consensus policies before even this term begins to be used. So you have what's called this open economy. That's a term used by J.R. Jayawardena, one of the architects of this, uncle to the current president. And but this open economy is accompanied by what critics call the closed polity. So liberalization when it comes to the economy, authoritarianism when it comes to the political sphere. And it's this period, perhaps rather than the one of the Rajapaksa's in the 21st century, that perhaps approximates at least one interpretation or application of the term authoritarian populism. Because very much, I think it is in that period of the late 1970s and early 80s that you do see this reordering of the relationship and the reordering of the relationship between capital and labor, mediated by the state, but of course in a way that is anti-labor, anti-working class. So, the roots of the sources of the policies which then create or widen the fractures or vulnerabilities that make this economy and this society, place them in such a powerless or perilous position come 2021, 2022, are really in these changes that we see from the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Changes which increase our dependence on the global economy, changes that reduce our ability to produce for ourselves. Also, of course, that through capital account liberalization and so on, expand import bill, of course, through luxury goods, and then, of course, conspicuous consumption, certainly an expansion of the middle class. That's important in terms of the protest movement. But still populist. Populist because not everything conforms to the neoliberal playbook. There is expansion in public sector employment. There is attention to the rural sector, to the peasantry, in terms of subsidies and infrastructure interventions. There are selective import controls imposed and lifted and so on. But I must say also reflecting very much now the emergence of cartels, rural cartels, agrarian capitalist cartels, which have a very close association with politicians, in fact, sometimes being directly represented in government. And then, of course, the nationalist aspects of it, the Civil Buddhism, reinforcement of Civil Buddhism as the ideology of the state, and then don't forget also, of course, this is the period in which we plunge into an internal war, but also the period in which we see the insurrection of youth and armed movement of Sinhala youth in the south, the second JVP insurrection. And remember, all of this, this spending and so on being financed by debt, right? So it's a steady increase, progression. I'm conscious of the time. I will do my best to wind up now. I don't want to labor too much on the protests because all of you are very familiar with it, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the scenes of people in the president's pool. I doubt you used it, but anyway, it was nice to see citizens in it. These two scenes are just to kind of show you where we were a year ago. A year ago, just exactly this time, even perhaps on this day. Here we were. Participating in these tiny little protests on street corners. 8 people, 10 people, 15 people in different places, holding placards or banners, candles, because we were experiencing electricity cuts, power cuts. Sorry, I know this is a sensitive point for the South Africans on the call, which peaked at 13 hours. And then you see from March the scene come July, which is then on the right side, and here many hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million people converging, occupying, actually taking control of this building. This is the old Parliament House, which is now the President's office, so it's a symbol of presidential power. So all good and well. So you can see what you can see what we were able to do. We were able to oust a president, but now this is the question. Here you have a populism in power, that cannot turn the crisis towards another, because the people, because when the people speak about a corrupt elite, the corrupt elite are not the other, it's these very populists. The corrupt elite are the Rajapaksas in the people's imagination or consciousness. And this populism or this populist regime is removed not by way of an election, as took place in 2015, but through extra parliamentary means. So it succeeds, but then what comes after? Well, the Rajapaksas, as you know, have to vacate office, but who is the beneficiary of this? An unelected, unpopular politician, our current president. This president does not have an independent base of his own. He does not have a parliamentary bloc. And so he relies on the Rajapaksas for his continued survival. The parliament, remember, has not been reconstituted, so it reflects the mandate of 2019, which was an almost 2/3 mandate for the Rajapaksas, which has since, of course, whittled away, but where they still retain a simple majority. And yes, we no longer have the right-wing populism of the Rajapaksas, but what do we have instead? It's the neoliberalism of Ranil Wickremesinghe. And we have ratcheted up state repression. Just yesterday, we saw once again tear gas, water cannon being liberally used on students by the police and the military while they were engaged in peaceful protest. Last week or the week before, one person died in a tear gas volley in another anti-government protest. And there's been a demobilization of the protest movement, what is called the Aragale, being Sinhalese for struggle. And you can see really this multi-class composition and base sort of fracturing, support peeling away. But that's not to say that the protest movement itself is dead. It continues, but very much in isolation, very much almost as it was pre-Aragale, pre-March, April 2022. That's a weakness. In terms of where the political parties position themselves, their focus is on elections. They are not trying to mobilize people. They are trying rather to mobilize for an election because they see an electoral contest when this government is unpopular as being their best bet to maximize their results. But elections also become then ways in which you discipline the public, you discipline public discontent, and you also diffuse public discontent. Right? That was also something that we saw happening in the 1980s and 1990s with changes of leadership, changes of regime, being ways in which public discontent against opening economy policies, neoliberal policies were moderated or diffused without, in fact, altering them at all. What we had aspired to, what was one of the demands of the protesters of last year, even if it was always very vague, system change is once again elusive. So I don't want to end on such a somber or bleak note, and so I just thought to share with you, and this is, I promise, out my absolute last slide, and that's just by coincidence, just today the results of this poll have been published, and it's rather surprising. So it's wonderful to see that there's still enormous public support for the Aragle, the protest movement. But just look at where the public apparently stands on their views on capitalism and socialism. Now, of course, by socialism, I'm not exactly sure what respondents understood by it. Probably, I guess, their understanding of it would be really social democracy, which is, which reflects a continuing attachment of the citizenry of this country, I'm happy to say, to public resourcing and provisioning of education and health, and a commitment to social welfare interventions. I'm not sure by socialism, I'm not sure particularly that they're using socialism certainly in a sort of a Marxian sense. So there you have it. So I just wanted to share that with you, and thank you so much, and I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time.
Thanks, Kumar. That was brilliant, extremely informative and incisive, as always. I'm going to hand over to Sithemble for comments.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that really, really, really enlightening and insightful and really thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to try only speak for 10 minutes, and I've sort of bucketed my thoughts into three. The first is just some of the just from hearing Kumar's presentation, some of the theoretical provocations for me as somebody that has studied populism, and just some of the thoughts that crept up for me. The second thing that I want to talk about is or to reflect on is the parallels with the situation in South Africa, and sort of some lessons and things to be linked between the two countries' experiences. And then the final thing is around neoliberalism as a perpetual state of crisis, and what that means as all of these crises are like conflating. And so I'm going to try and do this quite quickly. So I found it interesting as I was preparing for today. I Googled, I did a quick Google Sri Lanka populism, and all of the article, all the hits, right, all the news article titles were things like how populism led to the crisis in Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan crisis, a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarian populism, a note on Sri Lanka's economic crisis and ills of economic populism. I mean, it's all the same theme, right? And really focusing on the economic policies of the Rajapaksa government and the borrowing to meet those deficits. And I thought it was one of the things I really appreciated, Kumar, from you, was the detail on the political economy of Sri Lanka, because I think that gets missed in a lot of what we as outsiders see, right? And so that, at least at the beginning, that there were these very serious shortfalls, right, to fill. I was struck by what you were saying, that the imports made up twice, or twice the amount of the earnings or the revenue of the government. And so for me, as somebody that then studies populism, there's a curious then case here of a populist authoritarian government being a popular uprising against a populist authoritarian government. And when you look at sort of the definitions of populism, whether it's Cas Mud or Peniza or Pierre Ostergey, who writes around South America a lot, there's this idea of populism as a rise of the people against the elite. And so here, this idea of the people rising up against a populist elite, or an elite that had used populism in order to keep itself in power and to develop this kind of dynastic politics. And when we then consider this idea of populism as a style or as a strategy, this conflation and confusion of identities, right, between the people and the elites, and who you describe as populist in either way, I think is just, I think Sri Lanka is a really interesting case about complicating some of that populism studies and populism theory. I was struck by something you said, Kumar, that when Rajapaksa was running the first regime, and that people only started describing him as populist once he was already in power, that you couldn't find anything while he was running for office. And I always joke that we call people populist whose politics we don't agree with. And so there was this very, it raises very interesting questions around who do we label as populist and for what reasons, and who self-identifies as such. And so there's something around the Sri Lankan case that for me really complicates in really good ways the populism literature. The second thing that I then want to turn to is around the parallels, the lessons from South Africa. When I got onto the call, everyone, I said that I remember this time last year when all the protests were happening, all these people on Twitter, and I spend far too much time on Twitter, all these South Africans saying, why aren't we doing the same thing? We should go to Cyril's house and go jump in his pool. And why is there no big popular mobilization in South Africa? And I find it interesting because South Africa has a big culture of protest, right? I mean, we have hundreds, upon some years, thousands of protests in any given year. And yet, those different protests everywhere that they are haven't coalesced into a real mass challenge to the government. Whereas with the Sri Lanka story, where there was no real culture of protest, and this is, and what we saw last year was exceptional rather than the rule or a common way of behavior. And it's raised a whole lot of questions for me around what is the last straw, right? In South Africa, I keep saying that the reason why we don't see sort of an amalgamation of protest is spatial segregation. I think spatial segregation is the best thing to have ever happened to the ANC. It's really difficult to get to the centers of power, whether it's political power or capital, if you are in townships, you know, very, very far away from the center. But nevertheless, right, when people want to, they will and they can. And so the big question is, what's that thing? I was being told about 2 days ago about South Africa at the moment, all about the secret memos about Eskom, and one that predicts that there's going to be a blackout in 2 months. 2 months from today. So everyone who's on the call, apparently you must, you know, it's like the around COVID, you know, where everyone was buying the toilet paper and the tin food and everything. Apparently we need to do that again, because there's going to be a blackout and it'll take 6 weeks for everything to come back on the grid once that's happened. Would that be what caused that kind of crisis, or that caused that kind of response, right? The political protest. And so something that's been playing on my mind since, just as an observer of Sri Lanka, is at what point do people say, this is it? This is the last straw. And I'd love to have some of your reflections on that, Kumar, actually, around what was it that was different this time that sparked that kind of reaction. And that sort of leads me then to the third point and the final point, which is that neoliberalism has sparked an age of constant crisis. And so where in economic terms, there's this repeated cycle of financial crisis that never resolves for any lengthy period of time, or whether it is in countries that have adopted or had forced on them neoliberal austerity policies, initially by force with structural adjustment in the 80s and early 90s, and then by choice. I think you saw South Africa choosing to take on kind of self-imposed structural adjustment in the late 90s, where by reducing the role of the commons, by reducing the role of government and taking away the option of a collective response to people's socioeconomic needs, you then put people in this constant cycle of crisis, because you're on your own and trying to fix things. And our idea about fixing things is heavily privatized. I was struck by you saying, you talking about how much support there is for the IMF solutions or an IMF deal, how much popular support there is for it. And I think that, you know, the language of privatization, of private capital and private solutions being the solution to things, the language of profit motives being, you know, the best incentive to fix things, has become common sense in many, many countries amongst many people, right? And so there's a limitation even of the popular imagination around what change really could look like, or what the options really could be. And so reflecting on that then for Sri Lanka's future, and perhaps also for South Africa's future, around what is the resolution to this in a political economy of constant crisis, whether that crisis is triggered by internal factors or by external factors in terms of loans and debt, and the intervention really and interference of external actors, whether those be governments or international institutions, or capital, or global capital, you know, where do you, is there a median, is there a normal, is there a settling down of this, given the constant flux that our neoliberal global political economy is causing? And so I'm going to leave it there and let other people contribute. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Sithemble. I'm just going to hand over quickly to Kumar for a brief response if he wants, and then we'll open it up to the participants.
Only to, just say thank you so much for your remarks and also for giving us these takeaways. I, on your remarks on populism as well as on neoliberalism being a state of permanent crisis, and absolutely everything that you just said chimes so much with what I have also experienced here. I'm grateful too for you asking or raising the second issue of what's the last straw, because I did want to make mention of it, and I'm sorry for reasons of time and poor management that I didn't, which was exactly to ask the same question of Sri Lanka, which was a year ago, actually in right at the end of February, maybe even in the first week of March, a friend of mine sent a WhatsApp message on a group saying, why are there no protests? Why are people just putting up with this? And just within a few days, you began to see these neighborhood protests, and then these neighborhood protests expanding in terms of geography, but not so much in terms of class profile. And then this build-up of resentment, which to me coincides with the peak of the electricity cuts, the power cuts. So maybe that's the cue, for what's going to happen in South Africa. So it's the day when the electricity cuts reach 13 hours, affecting school kids, affecting trying to cook meals and do the care work at home, and businesses that don't have generators and so on. Everything simply grinding to a halt, and that's the point at which people say this is a government that doesn't seem to care. It's indifferent to us. It's indifferent to our suffering. How can it be pro people? And this is a government that doesn't seem to have a clue as to what to do about the situation. So I think it is that realization that then drives people onto the streets. And I must also qualify, when I said about the sort of the history of the sociology of protest movements in Sri Lanka, what I meant was protests of this kind. Really last year's being sui generis, because it's not that we don't have protests, exactly as you just said, Dr. Mbete. I mean, we also have, we have working class protests and strikes. We have had, we had a very important farmers movement also in 2021. But actually, none of those groups, then participate in a frontal way in the movement of last year. Not that they are opposed to it, not that they're hostile to it, but they don't themselves participate. So what's missing is that alliance or that convergence between a largely, I could say, middle class, but of course urban poor, but middle class movement with these popular sectors, right? And I mean, this is something that Goran Turbon has also reflected on, right? New masses and so on, right? In terms of what's happening. So I think this to me is absolutely something that I'm also trying to understand from the perspective of political strategy, political action. What is it that we need for this convergence or alliance to take place, and in a way in which a working people's agenda becomes the agenda of the movement, rather than really what we saw happening last year, which was, you could say, a middle class consciousness or understanding becoming the hegemonic way in which the movement then understood itself, presented itself, and so on. Perhaps also then in ways which alienated these popular sectors, because they simply did not see themselves in it, or see their concerns and demands, and expectations. But which is which is not to say that it wasn't popular or wasn't supported, or that it doesn't deserve our support, and so on. So thank you again so much, Dr. Mbete. Thank you very much for that. You've given me a lot to think about, and I do want to also come back and think about the uses and sometimes abuses of this term populism. I am trying to see if we should be a little cautious about the longevity of this. I mean, how long does authoritarian populism last, for example? If you spoke about neoliberalism being a permanent state of affairs, is authoritarian populism also a permanent state of affairs? Does it simply keep coming back, reviving, recurring? Here I would be interested also then to understand, as maybe also from you or anybody else, this use of this term now by on Modi's India, right? If that piece on bovine authoritarianism and so on. I want to know. I want to, I guess, understand. What's its shelf life. But of course, the purpose of all this inquiry is to understand populism, this kind of populism, in order to rid ourselves of it. So rather than to keep simply chasing a concept. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumar. I'm so tempted to jump straight in with India thoughts, but I'm not going to abuse my privilege as host to do that. Not quite yet. Anyway, I'm going to open up for questions. Feel free to turn on the mic and ask your question. Just put up your hand, all of that, or you can also pop it in the chat if you want to, and I'll read it out if you're feeling shy. But yeah, it's open to
observations. I mean, questions. I don't have answers. So please, observations, comments, critical reflections.
Yep.
What I presented was a first draft of my thing and of some thinking. So there's a lot of work to be done.
I'm sure there must be questions. There was a lot there to seize hold of, guys. Okay, well, while people think, I might actually pop in some of my own reflections, and obviously I speak from the context of trying to make sense of a very durable form of authoritarian populism, which is that which we've seen in Modi's India. Now, what struck me in sort of working on that, and this takes me to the sort of theoretical points that Sithemble made, is really the relevance of thinking through this with Stuart Hall and Stuart Hall's conceptual framings and conceptual approach to the study of populism. And that, I mean, that's why I certainly in my work keep using I keep using the term authoritarian populism, because it takes us away from the study of right-wing populism or populism in general as a political style and as necessarily an oppositional project. This comes, of course, from the fact that Hall was trying to make sense of Thatcher's Britain, right? And Thatcher's Britain was, Thatcherism was a project of governance. And I'm wondering, and I would like to hear, views on this. It's a thought that's still sort of baking away in my head, whether it doesn't make sense to think of authoritarian populism as a project of governance, and as a project of governance that tries to do very specific things, certainly in the global South, right? Because We have, and I mean, we have cases across 3 regions that we could talk about and compare, and which we should talk about and compare. We have India, and we have Sri Lanka, and we have the Philippines, and we have Indonesia, just to mention a few in Asia. We have just seen the back of Bolsonaro, and there are also others, of course, in Latin America and on the African continent, and right here in South Africa, we are seeing authoritarian populism crystallize in a number of new party formations, in a number of non-party formations, defining others that are enemies, building up a law and order discourse, and actually managing to appeal to sort of across racial fault lines in the electorate as well. And what I'm wondering about is whether this isn't, political projects that are attempting to govern societies that after almost 40 years, in different ways, of course, of neoliberalization, are so, shot through with fault lines that we're constantly teetering on the edge of what one could, with simple terms, call a legitimation crisis, where, a standard sort of liberal, if you will, or what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberal ideology doesn't sell anymore because it doesn't deliver. So what you do then? Well, you take those accumulation strategies and you marry them to another or a different ideological project, which is very much that of authoritarian populism, in order to govern this sort of strange kind of interregnum, where neoliberalism is increasingly, a dead horse, which the elites keep on flogging because they've gotten no other alternative. And they need to make that flogging look good for some reason, in order to ensure the reproduction of some kind of political stability. So that's sort of my five cents worth on what we're looking at when we talk about populism in deeply unequal and deeply precarious societies, specifically in the global South. And I think it's significant that it's happening across regions, and across all 3 regions of the global South. So I certainly wanted to drop that in there and see what people think. Are there other questions or comments or thoughts? Please feel free to jump in. I don't know, Kumar, what do you think? Do you think, that makes sense in terms of how we think about, or as a possible way of thinking about populism? I mean, obviously, India and Sri Lanka, although being neighboring countries, are very different. But, across the sort of, if we think now with what we've, what you've said about Sri Lanka, what Sithemble has said about South Africa, and I suppose what I've tried to say, drawing on some of my research on India. Are we looking perhaps at governance projects that are more or less successful when we're looking at authoritarian populism?
Thank you, Afan. I do find everything you just said very interesting, and I need to, I'm immediately sympathetic, but I need to think about it a little bit more, because and this is the reason why I also stepped back and I wanted to talk about what had happened in the late 70s, and that's the period in which I'm invoking Hall. The reason for that is because I am also struck by, I'm struck out by Harun Akram Lodi's critique of the use of this term, and if his argument is that in terms of fidelity to Stuart Hall's articulation, then so I guess what I'm saying is that yes, it's okay. If we're timing when something happens, and I feel very much that like New Labour, operating on the terrain of Thatcherism in the 1990s, after the great Moving Right show, what the Rajapaksas are doing is operating on the terrain which has been created for them by the UNP, by the party, the historic party of the right in Sri Lanka, described by the left as being agents of comprador capitalism, so the old elite. So I just wonder, you see, whether how there's okay, I'm trying to understand about how it then mutates or modifies along that historical course, right, from 1977, 1978 up till when the Rajapaksas come in 2005. So look, I'm because I am a novice, I'm just beginning to dabble in this. I'm a little cautious about immediately nailing, deciding which mast I wish to, nail my colors to. It is. So that's my roundabout way of saying interested, but I need to reflect more. So that's but perhaps Dr. Mbete will jump in on this.
What struck me as you were speaking of was also how limiting some of our disciplinary boundaries are around thinking about this, and how very limited the political science populism literature is on understanding the global South and political dynamics in the global South in a comparative way. So there's a lot of talking or thinking around, Hugo Chavez in very particularistic ways, but very little comparative work on how we've seen particular trends or particular kinds of politics emerge across borders, across regions. And so my first response is that I think that there's something there, for example, around, really interrogating, using the work of Stuart Hall to interrogate and to complicate some of the political science views on this and that literature that's come out, which is very European and to a certain degree American, and how those there's a whole set of scholarship, I think, that would really enrich the way in which politics or political sciences looked at populism. The second thing is that what you asked around authoritarian populism as sort of this response to this awkward interregnum that we're in, just evoked something in me about what we're going to see from the ANC in the next 18 months. And kind of responses to this crisis, to the multiple crises in South Africa, but to the immediate threat of losing electoral power or electoral dominance at a national level. I do think that to some degree the ANC will retain political power after 2024 at a national level. But it'll be severely compromised. And how that will manifest, I think, is a big question for me. And I think we're already seeing hints of it, right? So the very explicit or very loud kind of anti-African xenophobia, and like the ownership of that in immigration policy. One of the ANC conference resolutions from December was that we should rethink our our remaining signatories to the UN Refugees Convention. It's the most absurd thing, right? As if that's the problem. And so I think that there's going to be a lot more of that kind of rhetoric. I also like this idea, and I need to think about it, but around authoritarian populism as a response to, as a way of governance, which, yeah, instinctively I'm like, yeah, totally, but I need to think about it. Yeah, so thanks. I'm going to leave it there. I see Jason's got something to say, and Nilika, hi Nilika, has put something in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Jason to ask a question, and I'm going to, at the same time, I'm going to read Nilika's thing in the chat there. Jason, go ahead.
I actually just have like an observation. I don't know if you want to go ahead and read the message in the chat, and I'll just go afterwards, maybe.
No, that's good. Go ahead, Jason. Floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I mean, these points really aren't like clearly formulated, I don't think, but I've just been thinking about a lot of the things you guys have been saying, specifically with reference to South Africa and things like that. And that's really what I can talk about the most in this part. So I'm not going to try anything a bit more, but it seems like specifically on what you said, Alf, about liberalism, and then Sithemble, what you said about sort of this emergence in in xenophobic sort of discourse and things like that. I think what I've been thinking about a lot, especially while I've been writing my master's, is how unique South Africa is in its manifestation of this thing of authoritarian populism, and how it seems to me it's not something that's maybe as clear cut as when you read the theory and when you look at a lot of examples. And what I've been sort of doing my readings on, it doesn't seem as clear cut. So it seems to me like South Africa is sort of headed from, and this is obviously just from something my like readings and my understanding and my analysis, is that almost a conclave sort of understanding of this, in that you're having different areas in South Africa which are seeing this emergence, but in unique and different ways. So sort of lends to your point on like liberalism and liberal parties. For sort of the DA, for example, our main opposition party, seems to be in between a rock and a hard place, in that for many sort of more radical people, they are not radical enough. They're still seen as a sort of right-wing party. And for many right-wing people in South Africa, they are seen as too liberal. They seem to be, for example, embracing LGBTQ rights, which apparently has become something in South Africa that, especially in the Western Cape, where they majority govern, is something that is not favored upon. I'm thinking of, for example, a lot of social media posts and things like that that they've done, in which a lot of white voters say that they would change their votes for a more conservative party. And so you see, it seems like South Africa, there's different conclaves of this sort of populism emerging. You have the Western Cape, which is specifically like Western Cape independence. You have sort of in Gauteng and the Western Cape, the Patriotic Alliance, which have their own unique brand of sort of xenophobia, authoritarianism, and things like that emerging in these provinces. And you have this sort of, if you go to KZN, for example, you have the IFP and sort of a Zulu nationalism there that's still like dominates a lot of politics in KZN and indeed the country. And it seems to me that like this sort of thing isn't manifesting in a clear-cut way. And the very nature of what I've been thinking about between what defines a sort of right-wing populism in South Africa, I've thought a lot about that, and how that in itself is not clear-cut, and how a lot of it borrows features from across what you would traditionally define as left-wing, and combines it with a sort of authoritarian, very right-wing, very xenophobic, very, something to that nature. And I think, that's an interesting sort of difference in that I've observed.
Thanks, Jason. That's really interesting. I've just been looking at Nilika's comments in chat, and obviously there, which seems to raise the question also, and I don't know if you want to speak to that, Kumar, about how repression has shaped the terrain upon which popular movements move, or alternatively are not capable of moving, in the Sri Lankan context. And I mean, I think this also it's also a question, obviously, here in the South African context, and most definitely, as someone who observes India in an increasingly authoritarian context, where the space for, not just protest, but the space for dissent is so constrained, in all sorts of ways, just more and more and more. So yeah, maybe I'll pass that on to Kumar to speak to that, and maybe and anything that came up in listening to Jason's point.
Thank you. First, my thanks to Dr. Jawad for her comment and her observation or intervention. Thank you for making it. I certainly so one thing that the penny dropped for me last year, around this time or later, when it became clear that many people outside of the sort of circles I knew, the circles our circles of affinity, knew a lot about the human rights abuses of the Rajapaksa, knew more than I did about apparently where they had stashed the money that they had taken, knew about all kinds of networks and crony capital relationships. And then I thought, hang on, so you mean you knew all of this time, and it was okay, and you still voted for them, and you tolerated all of it? So then what's changed? So I wonder, I mean, this is a general question, Dr. Javadi. I mean, so I wonder whether what changed was that, look, it was, so we could tolerate the fact that they had, committed war crimes, because anyway, that's with, this group of people who were terrorists or kind of, waiting to be terrorists. Okay, they could bump off journalists and, dissidents and whatever, okay, these guys are. So we could tolerate all of that, so long as we felt that there was some improvement or progress or space for ourselves. But that the moment the realization dawns that, and there was a picture I wanted to show in the slide, which was, you took bad enough you took our money, but you also took away our future, right? So so it's okay. So what I'm asking is, and this is not just about Sri Lanka, that is there actually a much higher tolerance for corruption, repression, downright, abuse and terror from our educated citizenry, but that the moment it becomes intolerable is when they say, well, you've been enriching yourself, but now you deny us the chance to improve our lives, to make our incomes, to afford a car, to buy a piece of land, to build a house, to whatever, to all these aspirations or dreams, not just of the middle class, but also those who aspire to be to become part of it. And that's the point at which, to come back to a question asked by Dr. Mbete, what's the straw? Where's the straw? What's the straw? So it's, and I did try to reflect on this, in an editorial, and it's when you see your hope. It's when you see hope or belief in something better, in having a better existence or life evaporate, at that point, your back is against the wall and you have to fight. You resist. I wonder. This is a question. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumar. We're running up against time, but I'm happy to continue for a little bit if people have further comments. I mean, one thing I wanted to say just in response to what you've said now is that there seems to be, different shelf lives to different authoritarian populist projects, and I think we're very often, I certainly am struggling to understand what gives some projects such an amazingly long shelf life, right? So you said, that sort of people lose their sense of a future, the sense of a possible future goes out the window, and that's what triggers it. Now, if you look at the Indian case, and if you look at actual economic indicators and trends, there's nothing to say that there is much of a future for the vast majority of people. I mean, that there's a youth unemployment crisis that's of spectacular scales. There's an inequality which tells us clearly that the fruits of growth are being concentrated, at one pole or one societal pole, if you will. In an extreme way, and one could go on and on and on. You have 63% of the population living in rural areas which are so deeply mired in crisis that the future is more or less out of the question, right? But still the center holds. And I think there's something there to be said about, first of all, of course, that this is a project that's been in place for a very long time. We're talking about a movement that has worked through Indian society for 100 years. And that also offers very strong, to use a Du Boisian term, psychological wages, by saying to people that, who have been excluded on the basis of caste and class hierarchies from the Indian nation, that actually you can be part of this sort of this common hinderness and this rising nation. There's a constant sort of tendency to come up with numbers about the fantastic growth that India is going through and so on and so forth. And clearly that holds things together still. So there's also these sort of questions about durability and shelf life that are quite difficult to handle. I think we actually lost Kumar there. I don't know, Jason, if you can see if he's trying to come back in.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah. I don't know, is there anything you wanted to answer to Mila while we wait to see if he wants to come in and say a last few things before we wrap?
Sure.
There is, sorry.
I just wanted to thank Nilika for that comment, that your friend saying, I really don't like this common idea that we're somehow docile. Our post-independence history has been littered with so much violence because people organized. They were violently repressed. And I think there is something there around some of what's going on in South Africa. There's been a lot of tension actually around why has there not been a big protest movement or cross-class protest around Eskom and load shedding and everything, and people saying, well, the thing is that the bodies that are always on the line are the bodies of the poorest in society. That's who, whether it was the Marikana massacre, whether it's the daily number of people who get shot with tear gas or who get thrown with tear gas or shot with rubber bullets while they're routinely sort of protesting, that there's actually, and that contradiction in South Africa where we can swear at the president, but if you're a poor person and you protest, you're also very likely to end up in hospital or dead. And so that tension, I think that resonates quite a lot with me, with some of what we're seeing in South Africa. And then just to answer here, Adam, I think those questions around how do we make sense of this growth of populism in power, authoritarian populism, whatever you want to call it, in the global south, I think is it's critical to kind of answering or to thinking through the different futures, right? That we all have, or what we can see going into the future. I think that there's something very important around this idea of how do people respond when they don't feel like there's a hope that things are going to get better. And yeah, and I think this is with the questions you're answering are a big part. The questions you're asking rather are a big part of answering that. Yeah, thanks.
So I see Kumar has joined us again. I wondered if we should perhaps now think about wrapping. I saw one thing in Adam's comments that I wanted to respond to, which is I think there's an overall wave pattern here which we can identify across regions in the global south. But I also think it's important to be attentive to individual national temporalities, and specifically the fracturing of what you might call post-colonial hegemonies. And here there's something that's very similar, I think, between Sri Lanka and India, which is that the process that takes us to the present moment, whether that's Modi Raj or Rajapaksa Raj, starts in the 70s. So for India, you could even say late 60s. And then I'm always careful about saying things with too great a certainty around South Africa, but the dissolution, if you will, of what you might call a post-liberation hegemony is in a sense less in its less advanced stages here, which is why what we see as authoritarian populism is much more in the form of new party formations, emergent discourses that whose major effect right now might be to push the political center, if you will, or to push the overall political landscape further in that direction, which is very often what right-wing populists do. It's what they've done successfully in Europe, certainly without necessarily gaining power. So there are those dynamics as well. But anyways, I wanted to give the last word, I think, to Kumar before we wrap.
Thank you so much again for the invitation and to everybody who's joined this evening. As I said, this topic is not something I'm researching in an academic sense, but we are living in this moment. We are passing through it, and we wish very much to come out of it in a better way. And for that reason, I must say the probably the most uplifting political experience of my life, of my short and uneventful life, has been the movement of last year. Just to see how quickly people's consciousness can change, just to see how quickly those whom we describe as passive, indifferent, apathetic can actually become suddenly the most political of humans. All of that, remains inspiring to me, and is a reminder of why my politics is about is based upon the creativity, the imagination, the capacity of the exploited to be able to one day take charge of their own lives. As distant as it may seem at this particular moment, there were moments last year when it felt a little bit more tangible, a little bit less like something you read in other people's histories. So I want to say a big thanks, and particularly an honor for me to participate in the seminar series out of the University of Victoria and South Africa. A reminder to everybody that South Africa and this island share a common colonial history, Dutch and British colonialism. A reminder that the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka was modeled on South Africa's 1967 Terrorism Act. And so so many affinities, including of course the Roman Dutch law. So for those of legal bent. So just to say thank you again, and I look forward to joining your future seminars. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mbete. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kumar.
Thank you.
You have really, I think what you've done today is that you've started a conversation which I think we must continue. And it's certainly the kind of conversation that CASA hopes to be an arena for in the years to come. Sithemble, it's been a pleasure to be able to catch up and to discuss again. It's been way too long, so thank you for joining us. And thanks to everyone who participated. It's been a really good session. All right. So be well, everyone, and stay tuned for our future events as well. We have more coming up.
Thank you.